Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Wrestler's class on this beautiful sunny May day. And you all turned out anyway to hear a topic that is rather abstruse, and I'm impressed. So thank you for coming. Today we are going to be wrestling with a question that comes up from several fields of theology, science, physics, and other areas. I believe that we may not get all the answers in the short hour that we have, but we're going to be stirring up some of the dust, and we'll see how it settles. So thank you. I guess we can begin with a passage, and the verse I have in mind is from Proverbs, and it simply says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but the decision is wholly from the Lord." That's the idea that we're thinking about today. What is randomness? And who's in charge of things? So let's pray. And Lord, we do thank you for this fellowship, this friendship, this chance to get together and to wrestle with challenging questions of all kinds. And we thank you for the help that you give us through your word to guide us as we seek to apply God's word to God's world. So I pray that you will guide us here today, and we thank you for this time together as we try to grow in grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. And we pray in his name. Amen. So I'm honored to present to you Dr. David Siegrist, who will be presenting with us. We'll split this class up, and David will speak first for about half the time, and then I'll speak. We'll have some time at the end for questions, I hope, and I'm sure there'll be some. As I say, challenging topic. David and I worked out the general outline of the topics, but we have not collaborated on the content. And so until now, I haven't seen his material, and he hasn't seen mine. So I have no idea where this is going to shake out. We're all here to discover something, and I have some slides, and David's going to go first. And then next week, we're going to talk about another question along this line about reductionism. What is reductionism? So please come back for that. And then the third, the wrap-up for wrestlers in the spring will be a class talking about natural theology and the theology of nature. What's the difference? And we'll be talking about that. So 3 talks on areas that relate to a lot of subjects in theology and science. So David Siegrist works at MITRE Corporation in biosecurity questions, bioterrorism, a lot of challenging issues going around, as you know, these days about that. So he has deep knowledge of the basic concepts of biology, DNA and proteins, and the way that the chemistry works in the body. So we're going to be learning about that, and in his talk, first talking about probability and randomness. So David, why don't you come up here? Thank you for offering to do this.
Thank you very much, Paul. Just want to say it's great to be back with wrestlers. I always enjoy talking to this group. It's a very stimulating group to be talking to. Look forward to your questions and comments. I'll just expand a little on what Paul said. In the biodefense area, I deal with something called syndromic surveillance, which involves statistical anomaly detection for early warning of outbreaks of disease. So I have actually been exposed to some of the statistics and randomness.
Lots of diseases, right?
And I like to say I'm a theorist and then an experimentalist with all those diseases. And I'm going to keep it that way. Okay, if we can get the lights. So probability and randomness. What is randomness? Okay. So can people see more or less pretty much okay? Okay, so randomness is a lack of correlation. So this is basically an example of random data. So this represents the background burden of disease and flu-like symptoms in a metropolitan area over a period of time. And lack of correlation is there's no particular trend in the data. So that doesn't mean the data isn't valuable. It shows that there's a background level of burden of disease in this area and that it's always there. It can be expected to vary. Okay. Governed by random events. So that's an example of random type data. So here, if people remember all the way back to like a year ago, I was doing a series for wrestlers called How God Did It. And it was talking about the fact that a lot of folks, atheists, naturalists, say that everything is a result of pure chance. And that there was a Dilbert cartoon a week or two ago where he was talking to his date. And she said, "Isn't, evolution wonderful?" And he replied something to the effect of, "Humans equals fish plus time." And that struck me. And I was thinking about it, and I'm like, and you think that's okay? You think that's just random? That's like the natural order of things? I used to be a student of political science. And we would talk about political theory, and we would get back into how far back do you have to go before somebody says, well, that's just natural. That's the way humans are. Or that's just what you have to expect. So I'm struck here in the scientific debate that folks seem to go back and say, well, that's just natural, that fish turn into humans? And really? Interesting. If I had a Chevy and I left it in my backyard, would it turn into a Prius? Let alone a Mercedes. So what I did on this, I was particularly pleased to find data from a Harvard professor who found a relationship between complexity and the ability to dissipate energy. Okay? So when people say in the universe everything's random, I'm like, well, no, I can draw a line through a trend in the data. And then it starts going up a ladder here, the knee and the curve. And as somebody who pursues statistical anomalies, I think that's pretty keen. When I find that, I like it. We've got a relationship. Now, this happens, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, across, and you can't read it, stars, planets, plants, humans, brains, and society for complexity. So we can imagine at the boundaries, society is able to dissipate an awful lot of energy. World War II, a lot of energy gets dissipated in that, in an organized way, per weight of the people who are doing it. Okay. So there's a correlation there. That's all I'm using this for, and we can go back and cover that other in more detail if anybody's interested. But to me, this would be compatible with the idea of creation. Okay? Because as you know, my theme is it's an entropic universe, and yet complexity emerges, which I find to be a question. Why is that? The world started, we believe, with a Big Bang. They don't call it the pretty Big Bang. It was a really Big Bang. And the world's been dissipating that energy, turning it into less useful forms for 14 billion years after that. So the major theme of the universe is decline, increasing disorder, eventual prospect of what's called heat death. We run out of energy. And yet, we see a progression where stars were created, planets were created, plants, humans, brains, society created, which is running against trend, right? Running against trend. There's increased complexity, and yet the law of entropy is not violated Because as you increase complexity, you're also dissipating a lot more energy. Sir?
On this curve, if you've got a chart, does that curve going up different for created objects versus organic objects?
Yeah, we have mostly the organic ones down here, and then society is what really kicks in the complexity.
Okay, World War I, World War II starts out with single fighters, and in 1945 it takes 10 very good guys simply to keep that thing in the air.
Right. I'm thinking more like, let's think of the internet. We're going to talk next week, I'm going to mention something called complex adaptive systems. So once you reach a certain amount of complexity in a hierarchical system, suddenly you spring into complexity. We can think about that for the internet, for the economy, for World War II, what have you. Okay, so the point I was trying to make here, I always like to go back and pound on that point about randomness, okay? It ain't random. We can draw a line through it. There's something going on, right? There's something that's correlated, a relationship. And it carries over inanimate, animate to human society. So we think we see a trend there of something that is not random. Not random. Okay, so first slide indicated random data. Now I'm talking about non-random. Okay, now we're going to switch to evolution and apply randomness to evolution. So evolution is a mixture of inheritance, mutation, and selection, so that offspring share a lot of the genetic makeup of their parents, but there are minor variations called mutations. And these are essentially random. According to naturalists, these are random mutations. And then some of these random mutations enable their possessors to live longer and have their own offspring. And that would be the concept of natural selection, in that variety is created. And then Mother Nature, with her winnowing scythe, goes through and takes the ones that are less fit. And fitness is a circular definition, so that things that survive are more fit, but fitness is things that survive. Circular. Okay? So that there's no Mother Nature who's saying, oh, this is a good mutation, I'm going to do this and not that for a purpose that's going to be in the future. How do you know? So it relies on randomness. For instance, monkeys. Monkeys have very powerful jaws, and their handlers can lose fingers because the monkeys just bite them, right? So one mutation in a common ancestor made that jaw muscle less strong and had less attachment area for the muscles. Seemingly that would make it less fit, because you'd figure monkeys, going out, it's not all bananas. Sometimes you gotta find something a little tougher, nut to crack or something. Well, so they tell me that eventually made room for a bigger brain. So over time, it turned into a value, whereas at the beginning, it looks like it's a suboptimal variation. Okay. So I hope to talk more about this in the fall. We're going to be talking about the increase of complexity in biological systems and where does it come from? Because just because something is more complex doesn't necessarily mean it's going to increase your survival value. When you have added complexity, that creates burden that may militate against reproduction. So where does this information for the increased complexity come from? And I'm going to be talking about that, I think, in the fall here. Herm.
Yeah, I'm wondering how if you have a group of, say, one species of mammals, and then, say, monkeys, and one part of it has an adaptation that allows it to better survive, but the other group is still persistent. How does it result that you have a new species form? How come the new group cannot interbreed with the old group?
Okay. Let's save that one for for next semester. And I'm going to have, if you will, a more set-piece attack on that. But basically the answer is that there are ecological niches, and as long as you've got your niche, you're happy and you don't change that much. But if you get transported, say, to the Galapagos Islands, where you have a small group that's isolated, that magnifies the results of the mutations, and you can form new species, as for instance, with the different finches that Darwin found on the different Galapagos Islands. And we can...
But you still have to explain why the sperm cannot unite with the egg of the...
Well, that would be a result of the difference, but now we're finding that the Neanderthals interbred with the Homo sapiens, so I think still a little bit of a gray area there. We'll talk later. Okay. Good. Okay. So, all right. So getting back to randomness and evolution. Okay. So that Darwin, I think, sought to fairly successfully explain the survival of the fittest. It's a very Malthusian concept. There is more living things than there is food, and they select out. Okay. What I don't think he adequately explained is how to account for the arrival of the fittest. Where did those beneficial mutations come from? And is it possible that these beneficial mutations that the theory relies on were completely random? Does that compute? That's what we're talking about. Okay, and this...
David?
Yes, sir?
How can you call a mutation beneficial except ex post, after it has survived? I thought you were telling us that mutations were themselves random.
Yes.
And the application of the word beneficial to a random event, it seems to me, can only be seen after the event rather than preceding.
Yeah, and I was trying to make that a very similar point, in that it's only retrospectively that you can look back and see that this one was beneficial, but it's hard to know it. You can't know it at the time, and then certain times you can surprise yourself. Okay. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip that point. Okay. So, will random generation of biovariety is hard. And it's hard to see that, but in the graphic there, I'm very pleased. I have a graphic of a large number of monkeys equipped with typewriters that are trying to write Shakespeare. So it's claimed that randomness over time, with an infinite number of monkeys in an infinite amount of time, they will write all the Shakespeare plays. Okay. So how realistic is that in a biological context, right?
The numbers are available. Somebody calculated.
Okay. Well, and I've got somebody who calculated in the biological area. He talks about the fact that proteins are strings of 20 different amino acids, and that basically, there's amino acids, and they're like beads on a string. And you get an assortment of 20. There's actually, I think, over 100 amino acids. Mother Nature uses 20 of them to make, for instance, us, proteins, right? So a protein might be 100 different amino acids. There are peptides which are smaller. Okay. But of that, of the 20 different amino acids, that they have to be in the right order for their, what's called their primary shape. Their secondary shape, they form different shape. And then they fold into their final shape, which is what is required to make it biologically active and functioning. It's tertiary structure. Okay. Just to get there, according to this author, who wrote a book called The Arrival of the Fittest, he says that 100 amino acids in one protein, regular-sized protein, could form 10 to the 130th power different ways, different combinations. So his assertion is that you can't get there from here randomly. Okay. If it's just random, it's unlikely that for the 1,000 different type of proteins in your body, whatever, that they could all come up in a certain amount of time. Moreover, so let's go back to the start of time. Walter Alcazar in 1969 calculated that the world has been around for 10 to the 25th nanoseconds. Okay. And that he believes that there are fewer than 10 to the 85th elementary particles in the whole universe. So I'm afraid I have to just ask you to bear with me on this one. But the calculation he made is that if there is a string of 75 different events that cause us to be what we are, the odds are that happens only once since the start of the Earth. So there's complicated math and figuring behind this. What I'm trying to convey to you is that from a pure randomness point of view, it doesn't appear consistent with the fact that just randomly there's been enough time to create all the different proteins that we've got. And in effect, the fact that Taggart has calculated that a lot of life started on this planet within 200 to 300 million years, that's way less than 10 to the 25th nanosecond. And I give here an example of the Krebs cycle, which again it's a self-catalyzing circuit of chemical reactions that renew the energy in the cell. Okay? Tremendously complex, and we've all got it. It happened early. So I'm using this as an example, counterexample of somebody saying, well, this randomly, it just happened. Really? You know, how did it just happen? Because according to the math, on a prima facie basis, the math doesn't calculate easily out for just that, for things happening due to random nature. Okay. So, in the fall, I plan to talk a little bit about something called the extended evolutionary synthesis, which gives clues as to how some of this could happen in a non-random fashion. And it's a whole huge topic. But right now, my topic is randomness, and I'm saying randomness don't get you there on a face validity basis. It's a subject of contention. But the numbers, to me, I'm not liking those odds of things happening just randomly.
Could you say, sir, apparent randomness that would ultimately, over time, get to the point you would see it as a larger pattern?
I'm sorry, I didn't get your question.
Would it be more correct verbiage to use apparent randomness at first glance that will ultimately develop into, we can see the larger pattern of what this is a part, this is...
Well, I think I hope I did that on the second slide when I showed the correlation. So I'm showing that there is...
I'm stupid, and I'm sitting too far away from it. I didn't get it.
Oh, okay, yeah. But I'm just, that was what I was trying to do, is that random nature can assume a pattern, and then you find out, hey, that wasn't all that random after all. There must be something underlying it that's at work that we haven't put our hands on.
There's a more complex system we have not yet captured.
Underlying it, yes.
We have not yet captured it.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
And so one way to look at that is saying two leading approaches to that would be the scientific way, which is, yeah, there's underlying principles that we haven't discovered yet, but we'll find them, which is a very reasonable position. And the other position might be, well, God did it. Or it could be both, you know? So those are like two leading contenders, and that's kind of what I'm trying to open up, those kind of ideas.
Thank you.
Okay. So now let's switch to God and randomness. Thomas Aquinas said that in the world there's necessity, contingency, and providence. So necessity would be kind of like physical laws. They tend to be necessary. F equals ma. You know, it's always going to happen. And you like it when the guy hits the ball with his bat, you know, with the bases loaded. Okay? Work the same way most every time. Contingency is based on chance. Some things happen, but they might not. Your mother might not have met your father 23 years ago, and you might not be here. Could be. Okay? But then there's providence. So according to Aquinas, God has created both randomness and necessity, and he can work his will to express his grace through the world as he sees fit. And I was trying out this idea on my group, and so Bruce came up with the addendum. There's also human volition. Humans have agency. They can make something happen. So that if we're independent people, we have will, and we can affect the time chain of events. And this is opposed to extreme naturalists who think that we're all just the sum of our neurons and our inputs, and they lead directly to our outputs, and we just have the illusion of free will. So we're against that. So my corollary to Bruce is accountability of human accountability. Some of those changes can leave a mark, and we're responsible for our acts of volition in the pageant, if you will, of creation. Okay, so how might this work in practice? Well, I'm indebted to Darrell Domning on this, and this is more plot points. So if we believe that God created the universe and is having it work itself out through necessity and contingency, but is also perhaps keeping his thumb on the scale so that the world does what he wanted it to do, what he intends it to do, to intervene, then what might that look like? So it's still a work in progress. So according to Dominic, God is interested in how we deal with creation, and we're furthering creation. As some of us know from the expanding universe, creation is still taking place. Space-time is still being created. Okay. God allows the universe running according to its own laws, including chance, and we can be a co-creator. Laws of nature include Darwinian natural selection, but natural selection involves suffering, death, and innate selfish behavior that we find at least puzzling, for a merciful God to create through the Darwinian type system, which is cold. Okay. But the fact that God chose to create in this way tends to put aside the question of the so-called problem of evil. Where in this world, God created it in a way that evolves, and that we're part of it, and suffering is part of that. Like the human condition, disease, death. Okay. And that God suffers as he would with an adult child, where he can't really tell us, according to Dominic, we're doing something that we shouldn't. God passionately interested in us. God offers salvation from the feudal Darwinian rat race. God does not design us in detail or coerce, but seeks to persuade us to do the things respecting our freedom. Okay? So what do we know from the Bible? We know that God is very interested in making saints, in trying to have us more resemble Jesus by renewal of our minds. He's expanding the kingdom of heaven. According to the Bible, we're part of that. We're signed up. And incarnation of Jesus is God's seal of approval on the goodness of the material creation. So anyway, I think this is all chewy for a bunch of things to think about, and maybe we'll spend more time on it later. So, conclusion is that randomness is important, but it can't do all the things non-theists ask of it. Randomness can't, I don't believe, and I think I showed why I don't believe that randomness can't account for the arrival of the fittest, and that for creation it can't account for where did all those proteins come from in the time period that they were allowed before they existed. Random by design, interesting thing that randomness leaves space for divine interaction. Because we're in such a complex system that even if God puts his thumb on the scale somewhere, we couldn't tell that it was not just the result of chance. Okay. And I think that God, I believe, can intervene in creation for grace. He can do things for grace. I don't think he needs to intervene in creation to fix things. In this case, for instance, creating proteins, I don't think God intervened directly to create all the different species necessarily. Okay? Because I think he would have set up a system that works on these underlying principles. But I'm reserving the right that he can intervene to achieve his overall goals, which are the extension of grace.
Talking about very complex systems, I've spent about the last 8 years since I retired working on New England and the Northeast United States along from the 16th and 17th and 18th century. Point in time, you're dealing with polymaths, you're dealing with our ancestors. What if, when the Mayflower takes off, it can't get to Virginia? That's why they thought they were going. What stops them is what Benjamin Franklin is working on when he delivers the last speech in public at the Constitutional Convention, which is what no one's yet talked about the Gulf Current. So the Puritans don't get to Virginia, and New England is still left empty. And all this this is a test case in a very complex thing with a lot of variabilities.
Yeah. So I think the question is that with enough randomness, will enough variation be generated that eventually kind of converges toward a similar end? And what we see that in evolution cases, for instance, if you take the porpoise, which is a mammal, and the fish, they both converge towards fish-like solutions to their environment, to their environmental niche.
Okay, in this case, what I'm trying to do is to suggest a very, very complex system that really pushes you to the edge, because of the 130 people who get to Massachusetts at the end of November 1620, only 32 are left alive 3 months later.
Yep. So, again, I think you're enforcing the point you made about the importance of randomness and what happened, and history changes based on things that are not necessarily going according to immutable laws, right? So that in history we have the so-called great man theory. And so Napoleon, for instance, Napoleon changed things. You know, if Napoleon wasn't there, things might have gone somewhat similarly, but not in the accelerated way they did. And so I think there's an interplay between what is called great man or
That's a persistent pattern, because Napoleon is, of course, Hitler's in Austria, and the guy who takes over is the guy that's not the central guy operating in the original culture. He comes from the edge like God comes from the edge. Just a theory.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So random by design, randomness leaves space for divine interaction. Nature has randomness built in, the uncertainty principle of quantum scales. The Newtonian clockwork world seemed more deterministic, that if you understood what the rules of the system were and what the boundary conditions were, you could predict the future. In the Newtonian world, you can't predict it. You can't. And with the real randomness, you can't predict it. If you are God, however, and you've taken the liberty of creating space and time, you can flash forward and look and see what happened. You're like, oh. Okay. And I would say our future is not computable. Not computable. That is, that even if you were God, you couldn't just take it and play it out, and it would all come to the end that you wanted to. And I think that that's a reason it makes us more interesting for God. If you could just predict what we were going to do, it'd be like a pageant. Wouldn't really be that interesting, I don't think, to watch play out. Sir?
So there's also the question of the laws of nature, gravitational constants.
So
Did it evolve, and this is the best, this is the one that survives, or was it set?
Well, that's the thing. So that we talk about necessity. So necessity comes in with at least 20 some odd constants that are preset that don't evolve. Right? And so the gravitational force being one of them. And it has to be just so, or the whole thing ain't happening. Absolutely. So you start with those. And so because they are so finely tuned and they didn't evolve, right, they had to be a starting set. So then it makes some of us think that the world was a beautiful thought before it was a reality. That a supreme being could go through and say, I could do thus and so, and then, well, according to group theory, I'd have to, and then, way to the neutron, way too heavy, but then it comes out, and then so the leading alternative hypothesis to that is something called eternal inflation, which is that somehow something called inflation started, which keeps throwing off bubble universes, and ours just happened to be one that survived. So that's the leading alternative hypothesis. I'm going with the beautiful thought hypothesis. Let's pick some other people for a while. Sir?
I mean, some of the idea, it's also thinking of God looking at futures instead of the sort of eternal presence that God lives in and so on. I was kind of C.S. Lewis's response to a lot of these questions about how God planned it and working it out over time. That we tend to think of God as like us.
Yes.
And an arrow of time pointing.
Yeah, according to Newtonian physics, the equations work either way. They're reversible in time, and yet we experience time as an arrow. God created time, so I would think that God would be kind of like sitting on top of the train car, and he can see all around, and we're in the train looking at the window, kind of watching it go by. Well, I think I gave you something to think about.
Yes.
Thank you for your attention. I'll turn it over to Paul now to work his measure.
Okay. Thank you, and I think we have some good questions, good interaction. We could pursue the questions probably for the rest of this class, and we'd like to do that sometimes in the wrestler's class. We're wrestling, and we're interested in trying to turn things over, look at it different directions. So I have put together a kind of a canned presentation on video that means it's timed. And so I'm not sure if we'll get through the whole thing. I'll play it in little excerpts and then we'll go through. But I think, David, you did a great job on setting this up and describing the challenges and the implications of this concept of randomness. And of course, David is coming from a biology background. I'm not a biologist. I have a physics background. And of course, nothing in biology can happen without the laws of physics, right? So I'm okay with that. But on the question of is evolution random, or let's put it this way, is randomness real or only apparent, as Howard suggested? That might be a way to frame this question. It also relates to the theological topic of divine action. Is generally the heading for that. How does God work in the world? Or maybe is there evidence for God's working in the world? Or does that get into a God of the gaps kind of an argument that has a problem? So that's the kind of questions that we're addressing here in this class. And I'm going to take an example from one of our well-known theologians, R.C. Sproul, a Presbyterian theologian who has done a lot of arguing about this question of chance. And he has strong opinions about this. He had a background in Greek philosophy and logic. And so I have a little clip of his. I'm going to plug in my thing here, show you this.
You want the lights off?
There we go. Yeah. Well, let me just do a little. Why have lights on? I have a little demonstration for you. We're talking about the idea that randomness just tends to increase entropy, right? And we've all seen that. This is a little demonstration that I want to show you. I just have a little random process that I want to illustrate here. I have these things I want to just randomly throw these things in here. Random process, okay? Voila. Okay? So friendly, right?
Very nice.
It's some pretty powerful magnets. Right? So they have forces that permit them to form into a structure, right? That's just a simple little physics example. Now you can turn the light off.
You can
So,
turn water to wine, though.
I have some other illustrations of that. And here's R.C. Sproul. This is kind of the context of this. Oh, well, I have to switch my speaker over here.
Logic, but rather defined it and discovered it, argued that logic itself is not a science, but rather it is what he called the organon, which is the Greek word for tool or instrument of all science. Let me say it again. Aristotle said that logic is the organon for all scientific inquiry. Now, what did he mean by that? He said that logic is necessary for intelligible discourse. If I say to you, for example, that the piece of chalk I'm holding in my hand right now is not a piece of chalk, if I say this piece of chalk is not a piece of chalk, I have not spoken intelligibly. I have contradicted myself in the second premise from what I asserted in the first premise. And so now, logic, as the policeman on the beat, on the corner, he comes along with his big stick and he hammers me on the head and he said, no, 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 that doesn't compute. The statements that you have made do not fit together in a rational manner. Now, if we are students of logic and consequently students of language, we should be able to evaluate the statements that people make regardless of the scientific discipline from which they are speaking.
Okay, so with that, he's saying, I don't need to know all the latest physics and everything because these Greek philosophers and logic gave me a tool, an organon, to evaluate anything in the future, right? And so I'm questioning that assumption. But that is certainly the way R.C. Sproul argues in his work. Now, I have another clip here that I want to introduce, and it comes along the same lines of what we just talked about in terms of the fine-tuning argument from Dr. William Phillips. Bill Phillips is a wonderful man. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1997. He works at NIST right up in Gaithersburg here, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And he worked on clocks and cold atoms and lots of atomic physics, experimental physics. He is a Christian. And he gave a presentation at the Gaithersburg Presbyterian Church a few years ago. And I was there. I happened to film part of that presentation. I want to just show you a little clip from him here. This is from Phillips.
I wish I knew your answer. So this is the way I see it. When I look at the way in which the physical world works, the physical world works in a way that is just beautifully consistent. That is, there are a few laws of nature that we can use to describe many, many different phenomena, at least simple ones. It's really hard for us to understand anything that's complex. But a wide variety of very simple phenomena can be understood on the basis of very, very simple laws. And the more accurately we look at these things, the more impressed I am about how well the laws of physics describe so many relatively simple things. Of course, I'm always looking for something that will fail, because that means we'll learn something new, but that will just reinforce the general idea that I'm going to say. The whole thing looks like a put-up job. So let me say something about the historical context of that phrase. In the 20th century, there was a very famous astronomer named Fred Hoyle. And Hoyle was an advocate of what's called the steady state theory of the universe. He thought the universe always existed, and it'll always be the same. And as people started making more and more observations of the way things were happening in the outer reaches of space, people started to realize that the universe was expanding, and came up with this idea of what's called the Big Bang, that the universe started at some specific time. Hoyle was horrified by this idea. In fact, he ridiculed the idea by calling it the Big Bang. He was one who came up with the name as a way of ridiculing the idea. And the reason was that he thought it sounded too much like the biblical idea of creation, which he considered to be just, superstitious nonsense. But in the end, he had to accept that this is the way things were. And when he looked at physics in general, he was an atheist, but he was an honest atheist. And he looked at the laws of physics and the way everything was hanging together, the way in which the astrophysical observations were all consistent with this idea of a creation, but also the way all the laws of physics were working together to produce a kind of world in which we could live. So why is the world so well adapted for us? Well, you might say, well, gee, there's a lot of other places in the universe that aren't so well adapted for us to exist. But the fact of the matter is that the laws of physics have been a little bit different from what they are. We couldn't exist. And Hoyle understood this. A lot of scientists have understood this. And what Hoyle said was, it looks like a put-up job. It looks like somebody fixed things to make them so that we would be able to exist. And so a world that's interesting and complex enough that it could have living, thinking, interacting creatures could exist. It just seems unreasonable that such a universe occurs by chance. And Hoyle admitted that, even though he was an atheist. He said it was a put-up job. And the more I look at the laws of physics, the more I've got to agree that it looks like a put-up job. It doesn't look like something that could just have happened at random. Now, is that proof of the existence of God? No, I don't think so. But I think it's a strong suggestion.
Okay. Paul?
Yes.
Along that line, it was just recently there was a discussion with Lisa Randall, who's a physicist, and Neil deGrasse Tyson on whether or not the universe was a simulation and whether you could prove it if it was. And Tyson said, just in passing, that certainly the universe sure looks like it was something like, to the effect of, sure looks like it was designed. And he got killed on Twitter after that by all people saying, you mean you've gone over to the intelligent design people? And he had to say, no, I meant simulation. But what he said was that, agreeing with Hoyle and Norris, is that it sure looks like, as Hoyle said, a put up.
Yeah. Dawkins has a word for that. Designoid. I'm going to skip over some things here that are less relevant. And let me move ahead. See what we got here. Okay. This is another. Okay. This is a plot of
complexity 4, 5, and 6. And every one of these 6 protein complexes.
This is a simulation. You're talking about simulations. Lauren Haarsma, who is a Christian college professor at Calvin College, has been doing simulations of evolution with computers, where he simulates proteins with strings of things. You can discuss the question of model fidelity, of course, always. But the idea that he's trying to show is he has these ideas of plotting a graph over time to show whether this thing really can evolve and get more complex. And certainly it does. That blue curve up there represents the runs of this computer program over, this is up to 2,000, it took several weeks of processing. And these are the levels of complexity and the length of the proteins that he made. He calls them proteins, they're simulated models. But it shows that there are these jumps at various times where you get these things that he calls complex or irreducibly complex, which means if you take one piece of it out, nothing works. It doesn't work. So those kind of simulations are very interesting, and he's presenting this kind of data now.
It's irreducibly complex. You remove one piece and none of it works.
Okay, so that's another example. What I'm showing you is some samples of discoveries in the 20th century. Here's one last week. You all have some hail last week? That was on my desk. That's a pretty random process, right? Yes. Suppose we measure the interval between each of those hits. And that's a statistic, that's a probability. Actually, it follows a Poisson distribution. If you were to measure those intervals, they form, and they can fall into a mathematical formula. It looks like that. So things that look random, maybe not. Here's another example, Geiger counter. Random Poisson distribution of ticks, clicks from a Geiger counter. Another one was, this is something that happened recently. This is, well, that's the Julia set. I'm just, let's run. Claude Shannon developed information theory. He just had his 100th birthday last week. And he showed that things that seem to be random information actually is a physical thing, a physical quantity. It's not just, he took it from the world of the mind and turned it into something that is in the realm of physics, and it has a number and a measure. And so that formula was describing the number of bits that you can get through a channel. This is the maximum capacity of a channel. These are pictures of Jackson Pollock's drip paintings from the 1950s, which have a mathematical relationship. They are fractals, which means they're self-similar. As you blow up the size of the magnification, you get the same levels of complexity of structure at different dimensions. So mathematicians have actually made formulas based on Pollock's paintings. So what we thought was completely ridiculous, random stuff, turns out to have a structure. Now here's an interesting, this is a book by John Polkinghorne, an Anglican priest who is also a physicist at Oxford, a very dear Christian man, and he has been wrestling with this question of science and providence for a long time. So here's one of his books, and the book cover was kind of intriguing, so I'll illustrate what that symbolizes. Let this thing run here. There's a chemical reaction called the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction. Isn't that a cool name? These Russians put these chemicals together in a petri dish and just mix it up. So you have a liquid that's completely randomized and mixed up liquids. And then it turns out that you mix them together and it will oscillate. It will cycle between colors. So it'll change from red to blue, back to red, just sitting there. If you just let the dish sit there, thoroughly mixed, and then leave it, and now you watch it, and it will start to generate patterns. So it cycles between two colors, and they grow and expand throughout the dish. Right? So that's an interesting example of something starting completely mixed and random, and then developing order. So,
Paul, there's something unique in Russian culture, which is that the great scientists are also great musicians. This is 19th century, it's called Silver Age.
Yeah. Let's see. So, those are examples of things that illustrate the direction of time. And this gets to another physics question that we really don't have too much time to pursue, but Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, you've better heard of that. And You can think of Isaac Newton way back in the 1800s, 1700s. No, 1647 was Principia was written. But Newton, thought about the falling apple and the laws of physics. And Newton's laws of physics, which we use to guide spacecraft to the moon, they work pretty well. This is an example of Brownian motion, just some random motion of molecules, kinetic theory of gases. This is a part of Newtonian physics, classical physics. All these like billiard balls, they bounce around, they have certain angles, and you can calculate all that, and it's reversible. The laws of Newton's laws of physics are reversible. They can go either way. The formulas come out the same. But why isn't time reversible? Why do we have a past, present, and future? And this problem really bothered scientists around the beginning of the 20th century. Why is it that the laws of physics are reversible, but in reality we don't observe that? We observe time goes one way.
Too much complexity.
And yes, as you get things more complex, but exactly what does that mean? So this Brownian motion happens at the scale of atoms, but this was pondered by Ilya Prigogine, who's another Nobel Prize-winning physicist. He wrote a book recently called The End of Certainty, which means the end of Newtonian physics, the end of classical ways of thinking about the laws of nature. And so, for example, if you go down into the subnuclear particles, it's really small particles, things start to get fuzzy. You get this uncertainty principle. So we lose the ability to determine the direction or velocity of a particle. So Newton's laws break down into this distributions, probability distribution. That's getting into this idea of the uncertainty. And that's fundamental physics. That applies to everything, everywhere, all the time. That's laws of physics. Quantum physics. Very strange phenomena happen in quantum physics. Light waves are also particles, photons. So light is both a wave and a particle. What does that mean? Both of those paradigms are really our own concepts, and they're not necessarily what the real world represents. So our paradigms are shifting, as Kuhn would say. I can't pursue that too much further, but let me wrap it up just by showing another quote from Bill Phillips.
If we imagine a non-random universe, we can't actually imagine.
Cannot imagine a non-random universe
that in which we would exist, in which atoms would exist. So not maybe because we're not smart enough to figure out how that would be, but at the moment it appears that that degree of randomness is something that's absolutely necessary for us or practically anything to exist. And for physicists, the audience, what I'm saying is that if you imagine a non-quantum universe, one that was using just the laws of classical physics, atoms would collapse, nothing would exist, we wouldn't be here. And it's that quantum nature, which quantum mechanics is a pretty good self-consistent theory. And nobody's come up with one that's self-consistent, that can predict all the things that happen. So quantum mechanics has randomness built into it, so it doesn't look like we could do without that.
Okay, so two quotes by Phillips. One of them was talking about the put-up job. The universe is a put-up job. It's so carefully put together and precise, fine-tuned laws of physics that if it were slightly different, we wouldn't exist. And now in this quote, from the same meeting, he's saying, I'll read it again what he said. At the moment, it appears that the degree of randomness is something that is absolutely necessary for us, or actually anything to exist. If you imagine a non-quantum universe, one using the laws of classical physics, nothing would exist. We wouldn't be here. It's that quantum nature, quantum mechanics is a pretty good self-consistent theory. No one has come up with a better theory that is self-consistent, that can predict all the things that can happen. So quantum mechanics has randomness built into it. So it doesn't look like we could do without that. Okay. So there, I'll leave you with that to ponder for the next week. Okay, those two quotes from Bill Phillips. And next week we will wrestle with how do we reconcile this? Because at the, he has another clip in here I won't play, but he says basically there is no conflict at all between belief in God and belief in modern physics. But how does he put those pieces together? That's something to wrestle with. Okay? So I thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming to see us. We'll see you next week.